Hey guys, it's Popeye from FederalJack.com. We're doing a special podcast, video, like Skype conference call, as it were. Today I'm with Steve Stars, and Steve and I are discussing the Abraham Lincoln assassination, and because of the amount of information that was going back and forth in this conversation, I decided to record the audio, and we're going to put together a video, with some pictures and stuff showing what Steve and I are going to be talking about throughout the call, mostly Steve, and we wanted to get the information out there. I am going to have Steve on my show on Sunday, I have to look at my calendar here, the 29th from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. on the Orion Talk Radio Network. You'll be able to listen to it, micro 1650 a.m. And we're going to we're going to do a 2-hour show on the Lincoln assassination. But today, I wanted to put together, at least record the audio and then put together this video for everybody, because there's a lot of very, very important, good information coming out. So, Steve, I'll shut up now and go right ahead and tell the listeners what you were telling me. And I would say pretty much start back around like the beginning where you were telling me about John Surratt and everything else.
Yeah, we've in the past, we've done some shows that have talked about historical events, and a lot of people think, well, that's kind of interesting history. But we always try to relate to what's happening right now and how we got into this terrible situation as history progressed. And one of the darkest moments in American history, which really was a foreshadowing of the Kennedy assassination, was what happened with Abraham Lincoln at the end of the Civil War and the assassination of Lincoln. You have to understand how these events came into play. We could talk a little bit about how the war took place and the banking powers that wanted to rip this country apart. I believe it was Bismarck who had said many years after that the banking cartels of Europe wanted to tear the United States apart because they foresaw it becoming a major superpower, and they didn't want the competition. So the bankers were actually backing both sides of the war, of course. But primarily in the South, they wanted to expand slavery. Slavery was a dead institution agriculturally in the South, but they were looking at mining, and mining was very big. Remember, England had suffered under their gold standard, and the economy had gone very badly. But when gold was found in 1849 in California, all of a sudden it began to revive the capability of backing currencies by gold, and so there was a big gold rush, and there was mining all over the New World, especially in Canada and the United States. And here was the place where you wanted slaves, because they could work around the clock, 24 hours. I mean, in an agricultural situation, they could plant and harvest, and the rest of the time you have to take care of them. So slavery was dying in the South. Plus the railroads who were moving to the West were getting huge easements of property on both sides of the track. Sometimes it could get up, I guess, almost even up to 20 miles of easement and property. So this meant that they had land, they had places to raise cattle, they were building railroads. They were going to have the slaves build the railroads and then go to work on the land that they had built the railroads to reach. So mining and all that, they wanted to expand this kind of an empire, feudalistic system into the territories, places as high as Wisconsin and Minnesota. And, of course, from the very beginning of the United States, even Washington was opposed to allowing slavery in the new territories. And the Mason-Dixon line was about to be erased with controversies like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Slave Fugitive Act of 1850, Dred Scott, some of these things. So there's this tremendous amount of tension about where the United States was going to go, and that's what led to the war. But getting into the whole story about Abraham Lincoln, you have to realize that at one point in his life, he had defended a priest by the name of Cheniquet, Father Cheniquet, who had come to him and said, I need an attorney because I've run into all this framing trouble that has come from my bishops and the church. Essentially, they're trying to run me out. I'm trying to get some things done, and we're having problems, and they're framing me and trying to take away all my ministry, my churches. They're taking away my flocks. And they're making me out to be a really bad guy, even, saying he had the relationships with a little girl that was all proven to be untrue and everything like that. So Lincoln took his case and won the case. And what had happened was after this, Cheniquet said the Jesuits will never forgive or forget. They're going to get you. So you got to remember that all over the New World, the Jesuits had a very bad reputation. They were banned by Pope Clement XIV in 1763, I believe it was. And or was it 1773? But around about that time, they were run out of nations in Europe: Spain, Italy, various other places had decided that they'd had enough of the Jesuits after 500 years of intrigue, assassinations, political, mischief, all kinds of things. It has happened over and over and over. And so this gave a little bit of a reprieve in the United States for a period of time. And if you read the quotes of people like John Adams, you'll realize that a lot of people, John Adams, Jefferson, Lafayette, the General Lafayette, who assisted Washington during the war, all of these people had some very bad things to say about this particular organization. But they began to emerge again because I believe they actually poisoned Clement XIV. And when they did, and he knew it too, of course, he knew they were coming back and they were going to get back into control, hiding behind the Pope. The Jesuits operate a little bit behind the Vatican, much like the CIA operates behind the President of the United States. He can't control them. They have their own agenda. He has to rely on them for their connections, but at the same time, he can't really trust them either, as is the case of John F. Kennedy, another person who I believe was killed by the same people, the CIA, the Jesuits. Right now, the Jesuits control the entire spy network of the United States. Everybody from James Clapper, Leon Panetta, David Petraeus, George Tenet, and you look at other people like Nancy Pelosi, John Boehner, Biden is a Jesuit trained, Kerry was Jesuit trained. All these people who run our government right now are Jesuits. Now, getting back to the story about Lincoln, I hope I'm not being too long-winded. But let's get back to that.
No, not by any means, Steve. Actually, you are a fountain of knowledge, so feel free to continue and just talk and talk and talk. Go right ahead.
Well, I'll just keep going on the whole thing because we were talking about what happened with Abraham Lincoln, what happened with the assassination. Now, I worked with some people who were interested in trying to exhume the body of John Wilkes Booth back in the early 90s, and you may have seen some of these segments that ran on Unsolved Mysteries on NBC. We wanted to exhume the body of Booth based on some theories that we had that Booth actually escaped from Garrett's barn and got away and possibly blackmailed the government. As the story goes, that Booth actually claims that Andrew Johnson helped him and assisted him in murdering Abraham Lincoln. Now, there's some credibility to this because John Wilkes Booth's calling card was found in Andrew Johnson's mailbox the day of the assassination. And I've had the handwriting checked. It is Booth's handwriting. And the calling card reads, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you in, John Wilkes Booth?" Okay, and this, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was very suspicious in her characterizations of people, of course, but she also was extremely politically keen, and she was right about so many people. Lincoln even said, she's turned out to be right over and over and over. She was right about Chase. She's right about Douglas. She even saw, Grant's aspirations of being political. But she said, when she saw this card, it just freaked her out. She said, "I can't believe that man, that inebriate Andrew Johnson, is sitting in my husband's office right now, as the President of the United States." She said Johnson had some hand in all of this, in the assassination.
Interesting. Okay. Interestingly enough, the vice president named Johnson, who had a hand, without a doubt, had a hand in Lincoln's assassination.
Yes, isn't it? Yeah.
Fast forward to JFK, and President Johnson had a hand in JFK's assassination. But go ahead, Steve.
Well, this is what we've been doing so much of, Popeye. We've been showing people that some of these things that we're showing you from the history relate to things that happened down the road. It's not just interesting old history. I think we're really making some headway is helping people understand that the precedents that were set during the Lincoln assassination, they did the same thing with the Lincoln assassination they did with Kennedy. They locked up stuff for, 73 years or something like that in many cases. Well, Andrew Johnson was impeached. He was the first president to be impeached, but the impeachment did not go through to throw him out of office because he was saved by one vote, and that's, kind of skeptical. He was also, imagine this, just months after Lincoln was assassinated, he was hosting Albert Pike in the White House, okay? If you know anything about Albert Pike, that he was,
this guy's a Civil War general. He's one of the crappiest Civil War generals, by the way, but right. Yet he happens to be a master Mason. He founded the Ku Klux Klan. There's a statue of him outside of the Department of Justice. I love telling like FBI or cops or DHS or anybody that I know that are, black or even have black family members or, have a black girlfriend or whatever. I say, you guys don't like the Ku Klux Klan, right? You guys take that kind of personally, right? And they go, yeah, of course we do. I say, oh, how do you like it that the government you serve has a statue honoring the founder of the Ku Klux Klan outside of the Department of Justice?
Yeah,
And they just look at me, they're like, huh? And I'm like, yeah, go look it up. Albert Pike.
Yeah, the guy was a Satanist in a sense. If you can read his book Morals and Dogma, one of our favorite guests, of course, is Ralph Epperson, who talks about this. So he'll show you, any of his books, you can find out exactly who Albert Pike was and what his whole agenda was. This man was deeply involved.
Albert Pike in the 3 World Wars. And what's creepy is that essay that, and some people say, oh, Pike didn't write it, but what was written and said that Pike wrote, if you read it, World War I was started exactly how, and this thing was written after the Civil War, but before World War I. And World War I was started the exact way it said they were going to do it. World War II started the exact same way. And the coming World War III that they're starting now, and everything that you're doing is exactly as it says in this memo or letter or whatever you want to call it that was written by Albert Pike over 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. Go ahead. But that you're right on there, because again, what we're talking about, Popeye, is this is stuff that was happening then that you need to know now, because just like we said before, Albert Pike and this 100-year plan with the 3 world wars, maybe people have said, well, there are lots of references to the fact that this thing is existent. Others said, well, we can't really prove that it wasn't existent at all. But yes, history has followed exactly on course, just like you pointed out, Popeye. Whether it was real or not, oddly enough, it was coincidentally, in line with what has happened in the last 100 years. And we are looking at the consummation of the entirety of this thing, and that doesn't look good at all with the third and final world war between the Western capitalists and Zionists and the communists and Islamic world. I mean, that's what's happening right now. And so here's this guy in the White House. I mean, he's a Confederate war criminal, okay? Very deeply involved in the occult, of course. And Andrew Johnson is giving obeisance to him, you know what I mean? As if he's like a master mason. And Johnson is being raised in his level of masonry involved here and hosting this war criminal in the White House just months after Lincoln is assassinated. So that gives you an idea of who is actually taken over at this point. So, I mean, the story is very in-depth, but we could study a lot of things about what happened on the assassination. I think there's a very good chance that John Wilkes Booth escaped, that he was not shot at Garrett's barn, and that he may have been hanging around with a lot of information potentially that could blackmail the United States. He had ruined his family name. He had no future. He was a wanderer and a vagabond. Some say that he turned up in near Dallas, Texas, as a man by the name of John St. Helens. There was a mummy of a guy who claimed to be John Wilkes Booth. I've actually done the investigations, the forensic studies on all this stuff. And guess where I went and got all the information? Georgetown University Special Collections Library. I knew him very well.
Jesuit headquarters.
That's right. I had no idea that. See, here you go again. I had no idea what I was looking into when I was studying the Lincoln assassination. It all came out of our goals, which was to produce a Lincoln miniseries. We wanted to create a Lincoln story, just a good family story for people to enjoy. I had no idea what I was getting into here. I mean, the stuff is so deep that you start to realize, man, this is so satanic and evil. You definitely see the forces of light versus the forces of darkness, and the forces of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights versus the feudalistic slavery of 500 years of bloody, ugly history emanating from the Roman control over the Western world, And so, I mean, it's all about that. And here you see this fellow by the name of, his name is Judah Benjamin. And he is a very famous person in the Confederate South. He, obviously Jewish. He is a banker and involved with the Rothschild banking cartel, Popeye, and he's been an agent for them for quite a long time. And at one point, he's the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, and then another point, the Secretary of State. He had a number of different offices. I mean, he kind of floated in and out. At the end of the war, when everybody's fleeing there, he's giving money to John Surratt, at least $200 in gold, which was a lot of money then, and helping Surratt dispatch messages. And John Surratt does not make any apology or any denial of this. If you go on the internet, you can read his speech, which he was forced to quit giving, by the way. They put very heavy pressure on him. But this guy was involved with the assassination. He turns up in Rome. He was photographed in Rome. If you Google John Surratt, Surratt, you can see him sitting as a papal zouave. He's one of these attendants. He's wearing the little cap with the little gown and everything like that. He turns up in Rome after the assassination. His own mother swung on the gallows. If you saw the movie The Conspirator, this is what happened to his mother because it was her boarding house where Booth and all these other people were staying. But the point is very simply this, that the powers of Rome and the powers of the banking cartel, the Rothschild Vatican Bank that had merged in 1822 following the War of 1812, was determined to take over the United States of America, determined to exploit slavery, determined to break up a republic, because Rome has always hated free republics. I mean, they don't serve the Pope. And so as a result, they actually employed a lot of agents to tear apart the United States with a lot of hoopla and hideous, just bogus ideology between North and South as the bankers were feuding and building this war system up, as we've seen them do over and over in Europe, where they play both sides, the old Rothschild game. And then wanting to expand slavery, rip up the country. When it didn't happen, when Lincoln issued the greenbacks, which were a national currency from the Treasury, not a private bank, a central bank, but not a private central bank, owned by the people, meaning that the people got the interest instead of the banksters. Get it? That's the way it's supposed to work. This was really insulting. He freed the slaves. He held the Union together, and he actually tried to free us all from the banks. I mean, the real slavery issue that Lincoln tried to fight wasn't about the slavery of the South and blacks. It was about all of us to have our own money. Where are we today, Popeye? I mean, do you see what I'm saying? How all this stuff fits into everything that's happening right now? We've talked about the Titanic. And
it's amazing. Like, if history had just gone a different way, things would not be the way they are today.
Exactly. And what really happened here was that people did not actually investigate what was really going on with the assassination of Lincoln, just like with 9/11, just like with the Titanic, just like with Kennedy, just like with RFK, just like with Martin Luther King, Deborah Jane Palfrey, anthrax, the bankster bailout, the Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, we can just go on and on and on. They keep getting away with keeping these things covered up. And as long as they do that, we keep paying the bills, going off to war and wondering why we're losing everything, losing our children. We're sick. We don't have the expansion that we used to have in this great country with a wonderful economy. We don't have the freedom. Everybody's irritated. I mean, it's because we're being subjected just like the way they've controlled all the nations in the world. Greg Szymanski is a kind of a good friend of mine, and one of the things that he said that really sticks in my thinking, Popeye, was he said, he's been to Rome. Of course, he studied there for 6 years. He went over there during the Pachinko thing, the whole deal with the whole federal, or actually that big banking Vatican scandal. He was a reporter in L.A. and decided to get out of the country. And he came back. He was really disgusted with the entire Rome system, And one of the things he said is, if I learned anything from the history, I've learned that, everywhere the Jesuits go, they just destroy a country. They break it down into pieces and leave the people in ruins. Mexico is a classic example of what happens when the Jesuits get a hold of a country and drive it down. He says, I've seen this happen all over the world. And I hate to see it happen to your country, too. And that's what's happening right now. That's why the middle class is disappearing. That's why the same people are trying to stir up all of this same animosity with illegal immigration. They ruined Mexico, and now they want to ruin us. I mean, there have been some great Mexicans. I'm not against Mexicans at all. I mean, there have been some great ones like Benito Juarez, who tried to set up a republic. But look at Santa Anna. This guy was a Freemason, and he was also under the control and auspices and guidance of the Jesuit Church, the Jesuit, land holdings in Catholic Church. So Santa Anna ruined Mexico. I mean, people don't. This isn't about them not having what we're saying, the resources or the intelligence or the willpower, the ability. This is about those people being robbed for centuries by the Catholic Church, and now they're bringing it here too. Why do they have May Day, their day for illegal immigration? It's going on for 3 or 4 years now. Didn't have a big one this year. But that's when these illegal immigration discussions have always come up, or these big movement situations. Hey, I'm all for people having opportunities, but what's really behind this whole thing is the liberation theology concept. And if you look very closely, you're going to find Jesuits organizing this thing. They organize these kinds of revolutions. But anyhow, I mean, we get back to Lincoln again. The assassination of Lincoln was something that was carried out and engineered by Rome. And or basically, let's put it this way, the same cartel of people who killed Abraham Lincoln killed John F. Kennedy. They killed his brother Bobby, and they killed John F. Jr. I mean, they're here. They're planning to do these kinds of things. They're running your CIA. We talked about Leon Panetta. We talked about General Petraeus. We've talked about James Clapper. All these people right through that Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Affairs at Georgetown, all Jesuit trained. Then you've got Nancy Pelosi from Notre Dame, John Boehner, Speaker of the House, a Catholic from Xavier. You've got John Kerry, trained at foreign Jesuit schools. And where does he end up going to college? A place called Yale. And at Yale, he's a frat brother to who? George W. at Skull and Bones. How does this all fit together? I mean, how is it that John Kerry and George W. Bush end up as frat brothers at a very secretive organization? I mean, I thought that the Freemasons and the Catholics hated each other. Yeah, well, think again. I mean, Jesuits John Gannon and Tom Ridge set up Homeland Security. And who took over? Michael Chertoff, a dual citizen Israeli Jew. Okay, see, they're all interchangeable, these people. It's the same situation. So it's a big part of this. The banking cartel, the New World Order, the very high Freemasons, and, of course, the Jesuits, their Jesuit general, the Black Pope, are the people who are running this whole thing. And, as all these Patriot radio stations and so many different programs, and I compliment you, Popeye, because you haven't been afraid to deal with this, and Bob Tuskin as well, and so many others, where this has gone completely under the radar. In the Patriot Truth movement, who these people are. They run every intelligence organization in the world, from Mossad to ISI to MI6 and MI5 to CIA, NSA, up and down the ladder. It's the same people. And that's why the country is going the way it is. And this all goes back to the Abraham Lincoln assassination, Garfield, McKinley. I believe that they actually poisoned both Zachary Taylor and William Harrison. The first man to die in office was Harrison, and it had to deal with these banking issues. But those are some of the things that we could talk about. We'll get onto that on our program. I guess this is a good video intro for that, Popeye. What else should we talk about?
Well, you were talking about off air. You were getting into details about the fact that they hung Surratt's mother, and you touched on that, how they hung her, but you were explaining how her lawyers actually went and talked to the priest or whatever and said, look, we know you guys are hiding this guy.
Yeah, that's right. And you can see that in the movie The Conspirator. What's really disappointing about Robert Redford's Conspirator is that after his mother hangs, and she hung with the other, with David Harold, George Azaroth, who was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson. He was living right underneath him in the, I believe it's a Kirkwood Hotel, but chickened out. Here's the first man that, got hung for chickening out to kill somebody, right? But he was part of the conspiracy. And then Lewis Payne Powell, who made the attack on Surratt. William Seward, the Secretary of State at that time, Bill Seward, famous for Seward's icebox.
Yes, many people may not know that the night Lincoln was assassinated, there were other people in his cabinet that were targeted as well.
That's right. This is the reason why John Surratt was out in front of the theater as the timekeeper, calling out time, because he was coordinating this multiple attack. And this was brought into the trial. There was a one Sergeant Dye from the Union that said, and other people that said, we saw him out in front of the theater calling out times by the president's buggy. And then, of course, he's claiming that he was in New York. So he disappears. His mother is being held as bait to get him. And in the movie The Conspirator, I guess the guy's name is Frederick Aiken, who is the attorney that represents Mrs. Surratt, goes to her priest and says, look, he's obviously connected with the Jesuit rat lines that have hustled John Surratt out of the country. He's hiding now, and will end up in Rome, of course, where he'll be photographed. He's saying to her, to the priest anyway, on her behalf, her attorney is saying, look, we know that you have John Surratt. You're going to have to bring him back or she's going to swing. I mean, his own mother is going to die. And, of course, this is what you have to do. Remember, we talked about that oath to the allegiance to the artificial god calls the Pope, You have to be willing to let your own mother die in order to keep the secrets and interests of Rome out of the open from being discovered. I mean, look at these awful, atrocious, hideous pedophilia cases that just settled recently in Oregon and places like that. I mean, this kind of stuff is the skullduggery and evil. That's just the tip of the iceberg with these guys. But anyhow, the point being very simply that even Robert Redford, who did a great job with the story, of course, he brings up the whole situation as to why these U.S. citizens are being tried in a military trial. I mean, the parallels there. Of course, it looks like Gitmo. It looks like the 9/11 trial. They originally, another broken promise from Obama was going to be a civil court case, and now they're moving it to Gitmo. All this stuff has nothing to do with free and open justice where there's honest testimony. It's about covering the story up and getting it done. You know what I mean? Business as usual, and the people who run this business are extremely corrupt. And it should make everybody mad. But the point is very simply this, that, even Robert Redford did not deal with the real issue. And at the very end of the film, John Surratt is back in prison, but you don't know how he got there. You don't realize that he was identified in Rome, and members from the U.S. Embassy said, hey, look, you've got a guy that we think was a party to the assassination of Lincoln, and we just had to hang his mother, turn him over right now. Well, he disappears. He escapes. Isn't that interesting? The Vatican says, okay, we'll give you John Surratt, and then he escapes.
They helped Nazis escape after Germany, after World War II.
Was it only 20,000, or was it closer to 30?
I think it was probably closer to 30, if you ask me. But they'll tell you, it was just a few of them, and they were being persecuted. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. A war criminal is a war criminal, and 20 or 30,000 doesn't matter. You get 1 or 20,000.
Yeah, there's so many of them.
It's incredible, and it's incredible to know. People don't realize how deeply the fingers of the Vatican are involved in everything. You were also telling me how we didn't have diplomatic relations with the Vatican from after the end of the Civil War until like 1982, correct?
Yeah, and I think it was 1869 they severed all diplomatic relations with the Vatican. It's also interesting that in the Andrew Johnson impeachment trial that he was actually charged from the floor by, I believe it was Senator Butler. When things broke down and people were starting to get very impatient, there was one senator who charged him during the impeachment of being a party to the assassination of Lincoln. So at this point, it was starting to open up. They were really starting to figure out who these people were who were behind all this. Now, some people have painted up Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of Defense, as being a bad guy. You'll see him in the film if you go see The Conspirator. A lot of people think that he was a party also to the assassination of Lincoln. And it's very, very good reasons why they could think that. I'm not going to completely conclude that he wasn't. But the reality is I think that Stanton knew what happened, but he had already been the Secretary of Defense. He barricaded himself in his office when Johnson tried to throw him out. Johnson and Stanton hated each other, but I think Stanton knew what was going on with Johnson. But he looked at it this way and saying, look, we've been through 4 years of war. If people find out now what actually happened in Washington, everything's going to come apart again. I think he made that decision that really wasn't a good one. But he said, we've just got to get beyond what's happened here and get the government back on track. Johnson's in office, but he'll only be there for 4 years. And Stanton refused to leave his post. And, of course, General Grant took over after Johnson was nearly impeached but finished his term. But, I mean, it was a horrible time in American history. And if you look at the Vietnam War and Lyndon Baines Johnson, of course, there's all kinds of reports about George H. Walker Bush Sr. being in Dallas, being connected to George de Mohrenschildt, and that would be a connection to Lee Harvey Oswald and the whole thing with Operation Zapata.
And de Mohrenschildt, interestingly enough, blew his head off right before he was about to be questioned by Congress.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? All these people sort of disappear and die when the truth gets very close to coming out. So, I mean, we could go on and on, but I think what we've done is given people a pretty good introduction. We could talk a little bit about the details of John Wilkes Booth's supposed apprehension at Garrett's barn and why
Yeah,
a lot
get
of
into
it.
that. You were telling me that it might not even have been him.
Yeah, it's very likely that it wasn't. I mean, there's information that came out that was released in a book by Louis Weichmann, who was in the movie The Conspirator. He only had a couple lines. John Surratt hated him because it turns out this fellow was also going to a divinity school, but sort of broke ranks with the whole thing, became a government testimony agent, or he was a state witness in the trial, and was identifying Booth as being involved with the Surratt family and the boarding house and what was going on with this little group of conspirators there. So it turns out this guy worked at the War Department. You know, it's odd, the coincidences of all this. But his book was held back and wasn't even published for 75 years or a long time after that. I think he wrote it in 1902. And it was released, it was finally published in 1973, his whole account of the assassination. There is information in this book, Popeye, that came out, I mean, this was verified by his book, that was already going around in the conspiracy theory groups. In other words, how did Booth get out of Washington? There was a password that he was given, and according to the conspiracy theory people, he met with Andrew Johnson on Friday, the day of the assassination, and Johnson was the one who prompted him to actually assassinate the president that night. And Booth said, I can't get out of the city. You know, you've got Grant's guards everywhere. How am I going to get across the Anacostia Bridge? I just came across this morning. They detained me for 3 hours. There's no way I'm going to do this. I can't escape. Johnson gave him a password. The password was TB, # TB Road. Now, this was already in the information that was being published and printed by people who were investigating this from accounts of what happened that night Booth came across the bridge. And what was so interesting about this was a lot of this information was now being confirmed. Booth got through a Union patrol underneath a false bottom. You know, the old magician's trick, they took a wagon and created a false bottom underneath it, and Booth got underneath this false bottom. Then they threw a bunch of chickens and, you know, tools and some bags of hay or whatever on top. It had an old black man ride this wagon through the Union patrol, and they kind of looked in the back and they said, "You ain't seen a Booth, have you?" He said, "No, sir." You know, and off they went. You know, and Booth was inside this wagon. Nobody knew this, and this was confirmed as well, that he had actually gotten through a Union patrol under the false bottom. All these different things. Now, this is where he supposedly left his diary and his pen and his compass and all this material. He was wearing a Confederate uniform. He went to the Garrett's house. I believe it was, now we're almost 2 weeks, was it the 26th, roughly around the 26th of April at this time. He had been on the run. Of course, he had the bad leg. He had shaved his mustache. But he was staying at the Garrett's farm. And back in those days, you know, if you're a Southerner, you had to offer some kind of Southern hospitality. But the Garretts were somewhat suspicious of both David Harold and Booth because they didn't want to get into trouble. You know, they were in Virginia.
Was this after he had stopped by Mudd's house?
Yeah, he'd stopped by Mudd's, you know, almost immediately after the assassination during that night, and had his leg set, and he'd shaved his mustache.
Do you think Mudd was part of this vast conspiracy, or do you think he was just some poor schmuck that got involved?
I think that's what Mudd has portrayed himself as, but I think he actually was part of Mosby's Rangers, and this group that was involved with all this with the Confederate command had gone all the way into Richmond. Mudd had enough contact with these people to be, I wouldn't say he was a deep insider, but he knew enough of what was going on. So I think when Booth came to his house, it wasn't like it was a complete surprise that somebody involved in the rat run or this whole situation, you know, their means of communications in the South. So I wouldn't say that Mudd was extremely guilty, but I would think that he probably did know Booth and did know what was going on here. And he was somebody that, you know, it was another ally that they headed to, that they could call upon. But see, the Garretts did not really know what was happening with Booth, and they just were offering Booth and Harold. They were offering Booth and Harold, you know, some Southern hospitality, because at that point he was dressed in a Confederate uniform, didn't have the mustache. They knew that there was a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth missing, but he was hobbling around on a leg which was supposed to be a war injury, and so they were letting him stay at the house and down in their tobacco shack, which was just a big curing barn. It was a big open kind of a curing place where they hung tobacco, letting them stay down there. But they had some concerns that there might be some evil going on here, and they were afraid they were going to lose their horses. Now, here's what's so interesting. I call this my missing horse, my missing horse, theory about the potential of John Wilkes Booth's escape. There were 3 Confederate soldiers, they're actually officers, Bainbridge, Ruggles, and Jett, who were up on the bluff, and they had been watching the Union troop with Conger and Daugherty come down, looking around in that vicinity, because they had actually tracked Booth this area, and they knew that he had to be in some part of this region. So these 3 officers, these 3 Confederates were part of Mosby's Rangers. They were part of that same, network, that pipeline that I was telling you about. They had seen the Union patrol, and the Union had seen them about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, the Union made the wrong turn and went off on the wrong direction, and they rode on off at the T intersection where they were, back down toward Port Royal and Garrett's barn, and Booth was sitting out on the lawn. Now, we know from history, all accounts tell us this. Booth was sitting on the lawn drinking lemonade. Of course, the Garretts are getting a little suspicious about what's going on. They're hearing some things. And, by this time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he's being told where the Union troops are. All right, it's not like we're told from the historical account, the official story, the official story is that Booth was apprehended there almost 12 hours later in the middle of the night. Now, Booth knows exactly where the Union is. All he needs is a horse, okay? And there are 3 men riding horses there. There are 3 Confederate soldiers. I think that, according to some accounts, 2 men were doubled up on 1 horse. I think they gave him a horse. I think he took off sometime that afternoon and was gone. Harold came back with a Confederate soldier and a look-alike, a guy that looked like his name was Alexander Roddy, a red-haired fellow. And this was going to be Harold's cover, but Harold also had the diary that he had to fetch and all these other personal items, so he had this kind of stuff stuffed around there as well. I think Booth was long gone. This is the story anyway. So now the Union troops come back about 2 in the morning, okay, and they wake up the Garretts and they say, where are these men that are standing? Say, well, they're down in the barn. Who are they? We don't know. They're just down in the barn. So they go down there, they surround the barn, and they say, surrender and come out now. Well, this one guy says, we're not coming out. You know the whole story. You probably see it in the Conspirator or any number of these films about the apprehension of Booth. So they set fire to the barn. David Harold comes out, who was Booth's protege. He says, the man in the barn is not Booth. Okay, and then this guy's going to put up a fight. He says, I'm not coming out. Well, Boston Corbett, one of these Union guys, he's a Union corporal, puts his carbine on his arm and looks through the cracks of this burning, barn, and he sees the silhouette of this guy and fires a shot and hits him in the back of the neck. Well, he goes down and they drag him out, and now they think they have Booth, okay? This is the situation. Now there's a Dr. May, a fellow who knew Booth, and he's on record as saying, interesting. This man has red hair and freckles. This man doesn't look anything like Booth. He has red hair and freckles. Booth has jet black hair and an olive complexion. This is not Booth. And then somebody says, we just shot Booth. Let's see, turn him over and see if you can see the operation that you did on his neck where you removed a boil. Now, see, turns it around so you're not seeing his face, right? And, of course, he's been shot in the neck, too, right? So, oh, yeah, right, I see that. I see that. I can't recognize his face, but I can definitely recognize my surgery on the back of his bloody neck. Yeah, this is definitely Booth, okay? This is the man that became the body of John Wilkes Booth. Okay, there were other people that looked at him. Another fellow by the name of, I think his name was Allen, who was a corporal or something like that. They took him to the Montauk, a ship called the Montauk. The photographs disappeared. They were all broken. It's another one of those bin Laden stories. You know what I mean? We got somebody here who's supposed to be dead, but we don't have an ID on him. Okay, he's missing again. Another fellow looks at him and says, well, my gosh, this guy's got red hair. This isn't Booth. I know Booth. There were several people who went on record saying the body we have here, this isn't John Wilkes Booth. Okay, so now here's the situation. Harper's Weekly has this story. It's all a lie. You can see these two Union soldiers wrapping the body up in burlap and throwing it in the swamps of the Potomac. This is what Stanton told everybody they were going to do, because they didn't want a monument to John Wilkes Booth. They just threw him in the swamps. Turns out what they actually did with the bodies, they put it in the Washington Naval Yard, out there underneath caissons in a part of the arsenal where they kept parts for things like cannons and, wagon wheels and stuff like that for 4 years, all during Johnson's administration. Finally, when Johnson comes out of office in 1869, as a parting gesture, he grants the body to be exhumed from the Naval Yard and returned to the Booth family, which is where they buried it. Okay. Other people saw the body, weren't supposed to look at it, and said it had red hair. This is the reason, Popeye, why we and Unsolved Mysteries and so many of us have been trying to get the exhumation of the body of Booth for all these years. Because we said, look, if the body is there, if he's got the red hair, or we'll know from DNA. I mean, we've got people who will provide the DNA, but we can do all kinds of facial reconstruction. We can look at hair color. We can look at various number of different kinds of things for identifications, even height of long bones and all this kind of stuff. I've done a whole lot of work on the forensics on this, but we can determine whether it is actually John Wilkes Booth if we can get the body. But the Baltimore judge will not let us have it. Okay. What do you think that means? I don't know. I think it means that they're still covering this up all this time. And in fact, Booth may have escaped. He may have known and had specific information about Johnson, Andrew Johnson's involvement in this, and other people in the Union, and the whole thing might blow open and explode and prove that this conspiracy has been going on all these years. After Lincoln won the war, the only thing he could do at this point was shoot him and try to take over the government, decapitate it in a coup d'etat by putting Andrew Johnson, the sluggard, in there. And then you see where things went bad after the war. Same thing happened with, LBJ, of course. And then, of course, that wasn't bad enough. They had to kill Bobby and Martin Luther King and everybody else, too. But you see kind of...
Is LBJ in any way, shape, or form a blood lineage to the other Johnson, the earlier one from the Lincoln era?
I don't know. I don't think so. But, I mean, Johnson's a pretty common name, but they certainly are very characteristically the same because, in both cases, I believe they were both, the vice president that had something to do with killing the president himself. Absolutely the same kind of character, that's for sure. And look at the disasters that resulted in both administrations.
Without a doubt. It's just amazing information. And, Steve, you said you were with the family of Booth, correct? And there was something like, how many family members exactly were there that actually wanted to get the body exhumed and the judge said no?
Initially, I believe it was in our 90, what year was it when the investigation ruling came down? I'm trying to remember. It's kind of funny because I did a story. It was on the Denver Post. I got lucky enough because the main editor left town and a Civil War buff was publishing for the week. He says, I like the Civil War. Let's run your story. Because normally, mainstream, Times Mirror newspaper. But I ended up on the front page of their living section, and this went out all over the country. And Weekly Reader got it. That little kid magazine, or the little kiddie newspaper. I considered it an extreme honor to be featured in Weekly Reader because I know, now you're hit the top, when you get a chance to talk to, this was about science and history. Everybody was really excited about that. I was really excited about it because I said, man, this is great. Kids get a chance to look at how we can use science to learn about history and to verify history. Well, that's how big the story was. And there were 22 Booth descendants. Now, Nate Orlowak is still working on this. As a matter of fact, just recently, Brad Meltzer's Decoded on History Channel ran another piece asking these same questions. This thing has been around for quite a long time. I know the fellow Nate Orlowak. He and I have worked on this for many years. I've advised him. I've come up with some forensic tests. I've even got some things that I'm still working on that if I had the money, I could do the DNA tests and a few things like this to determine what actually happened. So this story's been around for a long, long time. But, it's interesting enough, Popeye, that History Channel doesn't really want to know about the connections with Andrew Johnson. You know what I mean? They ask all these other interesting questions, of course, but they don't really want to delve into the whole thing about how Andrew Johnson may have, in fact, been behind this, whereas Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack did a long time ago. Now, I never actually met or worked with the Booth family, but they were a part of our entire push and investigation. Nate Orlowak had worked with them and the people on that side, and that's where they assembled the 22 Booth descendants. And I think they had their attorney's name was Mark Said. And they were the ones who filed for the exhumation, and it was turned down. My job at that time was to give them forensic support using photographic superimposition, DNA, long bone measurements, and a number of other forensic tools that had been used to identify dead people for a long period of time. So that's where I came in. I still have a few of those in mind, and I've even recommended that they be used because there are some other things, a few other items out there that are possible links to DNA identification. But the question is, if Booth isn't buried there, why are they trying so damn hard to keep, if he is buried there, why is it a problem? You know what I mean? Why isn't it we can't have access to our own history here? This is the whole thing. Why is it that we're supposed to just accept whatever they tell us, whether it's 9/11, whether it's JFK, whether it's anthrax, whether it's the bankster bailout? Hell, we don't have to have an audit. Just give them your money. It's just absolutely insane the way we are bullied by this government and treated like children. And, we haven't been able to get into the body. We haven't been able to exhume it. There are other tests, of course, but what would it prove if Booth isn't there? It would prove just like, exactly what it would prove. What if we could prove that bin Laden was never shot on May 1st, 2011, that he was dead 9 years ago? Well, what kind of embarrassment would that be for a whole government, a whole economy, in a sense, or our whole administration here? These are the kinds of questions you ask. These are what we keep asking.
They're the important questions, Steve. They're the questions that have to be asked, because too many people have been, taught not to ask these questions, and they've been told that you're a conspiracy theorist if you ask these questions. But if you go throughout history, it's the mainstream history itself has posed these these anomalies, and we're just saying, hey, look, this is what's going on. It's not like we're making this information up. We people don't sit in their basement trying to think of how they can make fake history. This is real history. Mainstream reality history. The people that control the news media just don't want you to know about it. And the people that control the education system are the very same people. So, yeah. I understand why people are brainwashed, but it's very important for people to look back on history. That's why when Bob asked me yesterday on the show about the Titanic, he said, why is it important that we know about this stuff, especially with what's going on today?
Yeah.
History is very important. If you don't learn history and respect it, you're doomed to repeat it.
Yep. And that's what we've done. That's why we have the Kennedy assassination, the Bobby Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, the killing of Deborah Jane Palfrey, the D.C. Madam. This is horrendous. Even Geraldo was asking questions and thinking how can we allow this kind of stuff in this government and have any shred of credibility left anymore? You're absolutely right. And the reason why we point out these historical things as we've been doing, Popeye, is to raise these questions and show you how it got into this situation. And I really hope that there's going to be this day where we have a glasnost, if you like, a Russian term, open throat, or a moment of truth, where we come to the realization, we're saying, look, the country has wearied itself with lies. And we can't do this anymore. It's all coming apart. We've got to get back. The blood of 3,000 people swept under the rug in 9/11. I won't stand for it anymore. I won't vote for any candidate who doesn't want to get to the bottom of it. I like Ron Paul, but I'm pressing him hard. You need to make this an issue. It's time we quit ignoring this stuff. It's gone on and on and on. And just like you said, if they don't learn from history, they'll repeat it, and history's getting worse and worse with every repetition.
All right, Steve. Just getting back really quick because we got a little bit off on a tangent onto the vast conspiracy and agenda. But just getting back really quick before I forget, is there anything else that you want to add to the video here about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln?
Well, I think, if you look at it realistically, I'm not going to say that Lincoln was a great hero, but I think he was a person who believed in the Constitution. If you listen to his last speech about how he intended to as quickly as possible put the states back under control of their own authority, even though, of course, it was going to be martial authority to start out with. But it was at least going to be the state martial authority and not the federal martial authority. This is what he was talking about as an example for Louisiana, saying that, this would be the best way to go. Just get a state state law, state martial authority in effect first, and then bring the states back in as they, as if they'd never left, in a sense, and restore the old Union. And a lot of people blame Lincoln to a large extent for what happened with the 14th Amendment, and I can understand why, because the 14th Amendment, the way, 14th Amendment really came about, and the new 14th Amendment incorporated America, is a horrible aberration of the original constitutional intent. But I don't think Lincoln would have stood for that had he lived in office. So they had to take him out. They had to get rid of him. And they used the Jesuits to do it. If they couldn't win the war by destroying us, if they couldn't take us down, Popeye, by shedding, almost 500,000 people's blood, and rip the country apart, ideologically, or, use the banks to destroy all of our infrastructure, then they were going to do it by decapitating our leadership after we had won our own war. And that's what they're doing right now. I mean, even if we were to win the wars in Afghanistan right now, or Iraq or Pakistan or Libya, we'd come back to a state that would even be worse than it was before. And so, that's one part of the Lincoln story that needs to be told. But, what happened here is that they've been fighting us all along. They've been fighting our republic, our Bill of Rights. Now look at the Fourth Amendment's gone. Look what they want to do with the First Amendment. It's because they're evil, and we have to keep up this fight because, every generation has to, water the tree of liberty with at least the blood, if not the sweat and tears, of people who, are out there like you and I making this information available to the folks.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for coming on and be willing to do the video with me about the Lincoln assassination and getting this info out there, because it's important that people understand, the reality of history and not the fake history they've been taught. So thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Popeye. We'll get on it. Thanks, buddy.